He was the man every neighbor wanted, a hard-working contractor, a gregarious community volunteer, a Democratic precinct captain who could get a picture with the First Lady. For children, he was Pogo the clown, a figure of pure joy who brought laughter to birthday parties and hospital wards. But behind the painted smile and the firm handshake, a different man existed. This man was a predator, a sadist, and a mass murderer. Beneath the floorboards of his quiet, suburban home on Summerdale Avenue, he concealed a private graveyard. This is the story of John Wayne Gacy, a man who constructed a perfect mask of normalcy to hide a chasm of psychopathic evil. He didn't just deceive his victims. He deceived an entire community, proving that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who look just like us. We now pull back the curtain on the performance of his life to reveal the chilling reality that lay buried in the crawlspace. To understand the monster that John Wayne Gacy became, one must first enter the home where he was forged. Born in Chicago, Illinois, in March 1942, Gacy's childhood was a relentless tutorial in humiliation, violence, and psychological torment, administered primarily by his father, John Stanley Gacy. The elder Gacy was a functioning alcoholic and a brutal tyrant who ruled his household with an iron fist and a leather belt. From a young age, John was the primary target of his father's vicious contempt. Anything John showed interest in, from cooking with his mother to his artistic pursuits, was derided as effeminate. His father constantly called him a sissy, a faggot, and a mama's boy, relentlessly beating into him the idea that he was a profound disappointment and fundamentally flawed. This abuse was not only psychological but intensely physical. The beatings were frequent and severe, often for the slightest perceived infraction. This created an environment not of discipline, but of constant, unpredictable terror. Compounding this was Gacy's series of health problems. As a child, he suffered a head injury that led to blackouts, which his father dismissed as faking. More significantly, he developed a heart condition. For years, doctors couldn't find a physical cause, and his father seized upon this, accusing him of being lazy and cowardly, labeling it a weak heart. When a blood clot was finally discovered near his heart, the diagnosis did little to change his father's attitude. The damage was done. Gacy was conditioned to believe his body and his very nature were defective. This paternal abuse created a deep well of self-loathing and a desperate, insatiable hunger for approval. Gacy would spend his entire life trying to become the man his father could never be, powerful, respected, and admired by the community. He was driven by a pathological need to prove his own worth, to accumulate the accolades and respect that were so violently denied to him in his own home. This quest for external validation became the engine for his public life. At the same time, the rage he felt toward his father, a rage he could never express, festered within him. He learned to compartmentalize, to present a cheerful, compliant face to the world, while this inner turmoil grew. The relationship with his father was a blueprint for his future crimes. His father's abuse was about power and domination, about rendering a smaller, weaker person helpless. Decades later, Gacy would replicate this dynamic with the young men and boys he lured into his home. The verbal taunts from his father about his masculinity and sexuality also played a crucial role. Gacy grew up deeply confused and ashamed of his own emerging homosexual desires, equating them with the weakness and deviance his father had always accused him of. This internal conflict between his hidden desires and his desperate need for a masculine, respectable facade would define the terrifying duality of his adult life. The seeds of the predator were not sown in a vacuum. They were planted and watered daily in the toxic soil of his childhood home, under the long, dark shadow of his father. Driven by the desperate need to escape his father's shadow and prove his worth, a young adult John Wayne Gacy set out to meticulously construct the persona of a model American citizen. This was not just a phase, it was a lifelong project, a mask so perfectly crafted that it would deceive friends, colleagues, and politicians for years. In the early 1960s, he moved to Springfield, Illinois, to manage his father-in-law's Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. It was here that Gacy's ambition and talent for public relations first flourished. He married a co-worker, Marlene Myers, had 2 children, and threw himself into community life with a manic energy. His vehicle for social climbing was the Gacy's Junior Chamber of Commerce, a civic organization for young professionals. Gacy wasn't just a member, he was a superstar. He was a tireless volunteer, an enthusiastic fundraiser, and a master organizer. His gregarious, backslapping personality made him incredibly popular. He organized parades, directed the Polish Constitution Day festivities, and was lauded for his charitable work. His efforts culminated in 1968 when he was named Springfield's Man of the Year, an honor that must have felt like the ultimate vindication against his father's lifelong accusations of failure. He was photographed with community leaders, his name was in the papers, and he had achieved the public respectability he craved. He had become, on the surface, everything his father was not. But behind this flawless facade, the cracks were already beginning to show. Gacy was living a profound double life. While playing the role of the devoted family man and community pillar, he was secretly struggling with his homosexuality. He engaged in furtive encounters with men, a part of his life he kept completely hidden, shrouded in the same shame and self-loathing instilled in him by his father. The pressure of maintaining this duality was immense. He used his business trips as opportunities for these secret liaisons, creating a compartmentalized existence where his public and private selves never met. The first major rupture in this carefully constructed reality occurred in 1968, the very same year he was celebrated as a community hero. Gacy was arrested in Waterloo, Iowa, and charged with sodomy for coercing a teenage boy in his employ into a sexual act. The mask slipped. The respectable businessman was revealed to have a predatory side. The community that had lauded him was shocked. His wife, who had been unaware of his secret life, was devastated. The trial exposed the darkness he had worked so hard to conceal. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. For any normal person, this would be a life-shattering event, a point of no return. But for a master manipulator like John Gacy, it was merely an obstacle to overcome, a temporary setback in his project of public deception. His time in prison would not be a period of rehabilitation, but an opportunity to study the system and learn how to manipulate it even more effectively. The perfect citizen had fallen, but the predator was about to be reborn, more cunning and determined than ever. The 1968 sodomy conviction in Iowa should have been the end of John Wayne Gacy's public life. Sentenced to 10 years at the Anamosa State Penitentiary, the man who had been a celebrated community leader was now a convicted felon. However, for a personality as manipulative and pathologically driven as Gacy's, prison was not a punishment but an education. He did not spend his time reflecting on his crime. He spent it studying the system and perfecting his craft of deception. He immediately set about becoming the model prisoner, just as he had been the model citizen. Inside Anamosa, Gacy leveraged his organizational skills and gregarious nature to his advantage. He became heavily involved in prison programs, ingratiating himself with guards and the administration. He took over the prison's chapter of the Jaycees, the very organization that had been his ladder to success on the outside. He organized fundraisers, managed prison projects, and even took up cooking, eventually becoming the head of the prison kitchen. He was polite, cooperative, and industrious, the perfect candidate for rehabilitation. His performance was so convincing that he managed to secure parole after serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence. The system had been completely duped. It saw a reformed man, not a predator, who had learned a valuable lesson in how to better conceal his true nature. Upon his release in 1970, Gacy returned to the Chicago area. His wife Marlin had divorced him while he was in prison, and his connection to Springfield was severed. He was, in essence, given a clean slate. Instead of retreating in shame, he immediately began the process of rebuilding his mask, this time with more experience and a chilling determination. He moved in with his mother for a time, before setting out on his own. He was a convicted felon, but his charisma and business acumen were undiminished. He started his own contracting business, PDM, painting, decorating, maintenance, which would become central to his future crimes. The PDM business was a stroke of genius for a budding predator. It gave him an air of blue-collar legitimacy. It allowed him to hire a steady stream of young men and teenage boys, the very demographic he targeted. These were often runaways or boys from troubled homes, desperate for work and cash, individuals who were less likely to be missed if they disappeared. His business gave him a plausible reason to interact with them, to bring them to his home, and to gain their trust. Simultaneously, he dove back into community and political life. He joined the local Moose Lodge and became heavily involved in the Democratic Party organization in his suburban township. His ability to organize events and rally volunteers made him a valuable asset. He rose to become a precinct captain, a position of local influence. He orchestrated large neighborhood parties and parades, rubbing elbows with local politicians and even having his picture taken with First Lady Rosalind Carter in 1978. He had not only rebuilt his mask of respectability, he had made it stronger and more impenetrable than before. He was no longer just a successful businessman. He was a political insider, a man with connections. This public persona provided him with the perfect cover, an almost unassailable alibi for the horrors he was about to unleash. The first cracks had been sealed over, and the predator, now more experienced and emboldened, was ready to begin his true life's work. With his new life firmly established, John Wayne Gacy created the two most iconic and chilling tools of his murderous career: the persona of Pogo the Clown and the house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, which he would transform into a personal tomb. These two creations were not separate. They were integral parts of the elaborate stage he set for his double life, allowing him to operate as both a beloved community figure and a prolific serial killer. The development of the Pogo persona began in the mid-1970s. Gacy, always seeking new avenues for public approval and community involvement, taught himself how to apply clown makeup and developed a character he named Pogo. He designed his own costumes and created routines. Pogo was not just a hobby, it was a performance Gacy took very seriously. He performed at countless children's birthday parties, fundraisers for the Democratic Party, and, most notably, at local hospitals, bringing moments of joy to sick children. This persona was the ultimate expression of his mask. It was a character of pure innocence and fun, the absolute antithesis of the sadistic predator lurking within. The clown suit was a literal and figurative disguise, a layer of deception that made the truth of his nature seem utterly unbelievable. It allowed him access to children and families, earned him trust, and cemented his reputation as a benevolent, caring member of the community. While there is no direct evidence, he used the Pogo persona to lure his victims, who were older teenagers and young men. It was an essential part of the psychological architecture that allowed him to get away with murder for so long. In 1971, Gacy purchased the unassuming ranch-style house on Somerdale Avenue in a quiet working-class Chicago suburb. This house would become the epicenter of his evil. He married for a second time and lived there with his new wife, Carol Hoff. To the outside world, it was a normal family home. But for Gacy, it was his castle, his domain, where he had absolute power. He immediately began to customize it to his needs. He built a bar in the rec room, a perfect spot to entertain guests and potential victims. Most importantly, he had access to the crawlspace, a dark, damp, labyrinthine area beneath the house. This crawlspace, initially just a feature of the home's construction, would become his gruesome solution for body disposal. The house on Somerdale Avenue was his sanctuary and his slaughterhouse. It was here that the respectable contractor and friendly clown could shed his mask and indulge his most depraved fantasies. He could bring young men home under the pretext of offering them a job, a drink, or a place to stay. Once inside his domain, behind closed doors, they were completely at his mercy. The layout of the house, with its sound-dampening rec room and its hidden crawlspace, was perfectly suited for his crimes. As he began to kill, the house itself became a co-conspirator, silently swallowing his victims and hiding his secrets. The floorboards of the suburban home became the lid of a mass grave, a horrifying symbol of the evil that can fester just beneath the surface of apparent normalcy. Pogo brought joy to the world outside, while Gacy brought death to the world within the walls of 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. John Wayne Gacy's method of murder was not random or impulsive. It was a well-honed, terrifying ritual designed to maximize his control and sadistic gratification. His modus operandi was a three-act play of deception, domination, and death, repeated, with chilling consistency with at least 33 young men and boys. Act 1. The lure. Gacy's primary hunting ground was his own business, PDM Construction. He constantly sought out and hired teenage boys and young men, often those who were vulnerable or transient. He would cruise areas of Chicago known for hustlers and runaways, but many of his victims were simply local boys looking for work. He was a charming and persuasive employer, offering cash for a few hours of work, a ride home, or a beer at his house after a job. The promise was always mundane and believable. To these young men, Gacy was not a monster, but a friendly, successful, older man offering an opportunity. He exuded an air of authority and generosity that made it easy for them to trust him and willingly accompany him to his home on Summerdale Avenue. Act 2. The Trick. Once the victim was inside his house, Gacy would begin to ply him with alcohol or drugs to lower his inhibitions and defenses. The true turning point of the ritual, however, was what he called his magic trick. Gacy would show the victim a pair of handcuffs, often claiming they were part of his clown act, or that he was practicing for an escape routine. He would coax the victim into letting him demonstrate the trick, placing the cuffs on their wrists. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted irrevocably. The friendly host became the captor. This act of deception was crucial to Gacy's psychological needs. It was a moment of intellectual and physical superiority. What followed was a period of brutal sexual assault. This was the core of his motivation, the complete and utter domination of another human being, rendering them helpless and subject to his every whim. Act 3. The Rope. After the assault, Gacy faced a problem, a living witness who could identify him. His solution was murder, and his chosen method was as intimate and controlling as the assault itself. He used a length of rope, which he would loop around the victim's neck. He would then insert a stick or a piece of wood into the loop and twist it, creating a makeshift garrote. This method of strangulation was not quick. It was a prolonged hands-on act of killing. It allowed him to watch the life drain from his victim's eyes, giving him the ultimate feeling of power and control over life and death. He later told police that the moment of death, as the victim's body went limp, was the ultimate thrill for him. It was the final, irreversible act of possession. Once the victim was dead, the final part of the ritual began, the concealment of the body in the dark, silent earth of his crawl space. This ritual, from the innocent lure to the final twist of the rope, was the engine of his murderous career, a horrifyingly consistent pattern that he would repeat again and again. Asterisk, the crawl space beneath the house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue was more than just a burial ground. It was the physical manifestation of John Wayne Gacy's psyche. It was a dark, hidden, and compartmentalized world where he could store the horrifying results of his secret life. Mere feet beneath the floor, where he entertained guests, conducted business, and lived as a respectable citizen. For 6 years, from 1972 to 1978, this subterranean labyrinth became the final resting place for at least 29 of his victims. The first victim to be interred in the crawl space was Timothy McCoy, a 16-year-old boy Gacy killed in January 1972. The process became a grim, practiced routine. After murdering a victim, Gacy would often leave the body in a room for a period, sometimes covering it with lime to manage the smell of decomposition. When he was ready, he would open one of the access panels to the crawl space, a tight, dark, and foul-smelling area, and drag the body down into the dirt. He would dig a shallow grave, sometimes covering the body in quicksetting concrete or plastic sheeting, and then simply cover it with earth. The psychological fortitude required to live this way is almost incomprehensible. Gacy was literally living above a mass grave of his own making. He hosted parties where guests danced on the floorboards just above the dead. He negotiated business deals in his dining room, all while the evidence of his monstrosity lay decaying beneath him. This speaks to a level of compartmentalization that is a hallmark of the psychopathic mind. He was able to completely sever the connection between his public self and his secret actions. The crawl space was out of sight, out of mind, allowing him to continue his performance as a normal citizen without being crippled by guilt or fear. As the years went on, the crawl space began to fill. Gacy became a grim architect of his own macabre puzzle, trying to find new spots to bury his victims. He drew a crude map for police after his arrest, pointing out where he had laid each boy to rest. There was John Butkovich, a 17-year-old employee who confronted Gacy about unpaid wages and never left the house. There was Gregory Godzik, another employee, buried beneath the floor of the master bedroom. The list of the lost grew, each boy a secret held by the dark earth under the house. By 1978, the crawl space was nearly full. The smell of decomposition was becoming impossible to manage. Despite Gacy's constant use of lime, mothballs, and industrial-strength air fresheners, his second wife, Carol, complained incessantly about the foul odor, which Gacy dismissed as moisture or dead rodents. This logistical problem forced him to change his disposal method. For his final 5 victims, he turned to the nearby Des Plaines River, weighting their bodies down and dumping them from a bridge. This change in MO would prove to be a critical mistake, as it left evidence outside the controlled environment of his home. But for years, the house on Somerdale Avenue held its secrets. Its crawlspace, a silent, densely packed tomb, a private hell curated by the smiling clown who lived above. Asterisk for all his cunning and meticulous planning, John Wayne Gacy's downfall was precipitated by a combination of his own growing arrogance and the tenacious work of a small-town police department. The catalyst was the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest on December 11, 1978. Piest was a hard-working, responsible boy who worked at a local Nissen pharmacy in Des Plaines. That evening, he went to speak with Gacy, a local contractor who had come into the pharmacy, about a potential summer job. He told his mother he would be right back. He was never seen alive again. Unlike many of Gacy's previous victims, Robert Piest was not a runaway or a transient. He was from a stable, loving family, and his disappearance was immediately reported and taken very seriously. The Des Plaines police began their investigation, and their attention quickly focused on John Wayne Gacy, the last person known to have seen Piest. A routine background check revealed Gacy's 1968 sodomy conviction in Iowa. Instantly, he went from being a helpful local businessman to the prime suspect. What followed was an intense 10-day cat-and-mouse game between Gacy and the police. Gacy was incredibly arrogant and condescending, believing he could easily outsmart these small-town cops. He spun a web of lies and half-truths, admitting he spoke to Piest, but denying any further involvement. The Des Plaines police, however, were relentless. They established 24/7 surveillance on Gacy, a difficult and resource-intensive task. They tailed him everywhere, documenting his movements and his contacts. During this surveillance, Gacy's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would taunt the police, bringing them coffee or engaging them in conversation, all while maintaining his innocence. But the investigators were building their case. They found a crucial piece of evidence, a film receipt in Gacy's trash from the very pharmacy where Piest worked, connecting Gacy directly to the scene. The receipt belonged to Piest's mother. They also interviewed PDM employees who told them disturbing stories about Gacy's house and his behavior. The pressure mounted until the police felt they had enough probable cause for a search warrant. On December 21, 1978, they arrived at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. Gacy, ever the confident performer, let them in. The initial search revealed several suspicious items, including items of clothing that appeared to belong to other young men and a collection of disturbing homosexual pornography. But the real breakthrough came from a lingering foul odor. One detective noticed a loose floorboard and the overwhelming smell of decay emanating from the crawl space. Even with the mounting evidence, the final piece of the puzzle came from Gacy's own exhausted psyche. After days of relentless interrogation, sleep-deprived and cornered, he finally broke. He confessed to the detectives. "The others are in the house. You know, the bodies." With that, the net had closed. The search of the house turned from an investigation into a gruesome excavation. The 10-day disappearance of one boy had finally exposed a mass murderer and uncovered a suburban house of horrors that would shock the world. The excavation of the house on Somerdale Avenue was a media spectacle that horrified the globe. As forensic teams in hazmat suits began the grim task of digging through the crawl space, the world watched in disbelief. One by one, the remains of young men and boys were recovered, their bodies often tangled together in the shallow graves. In total, 29 bodies were recovered from the property, with another 4 having been recovered from the Des Plaines River. The sheer scale of the massacre was unfathomable. Gacy, now in custody, seemed almost relieved. He cooperated with police, providing a detailed confession that was both chilling in its content and casual in its delivery. He nonchalantly drew a map of the crawl space, marking the locations of his victims as if he were plotting a garden. He recounted the details of his crimes with a disturbing lack of emotion, a man finally unburdening himself of secrets he could no longer contain. His trial in 1980 was a sensation. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the defense team had only one viable strategy, a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. They argued that Gacy suffered from a multiple personality disorder, and that an alternate personality, a violent alter ego named Jack, was responsible for the murders. Gacy, they claimed, had no control over Jack's actions. The prosecution systematically dismantled this defense, portraying Gacy as a cunning, manipulative predator who was in complete control of his actions. They presented his meticulous planning, his attempts to conceal evidence, and his years of successful deception as proof of his sanity. The jury agreed with the prosecution. After a 6-week trial, they took less than 2 hours to find John Wayne Gacy guilty of 33 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death for 12 of those murders. Gacy spent the next 14 years on death row, and his arrogance never waned. He showed no remorse, often blaming his victims by saying, "They were all hustlers. A secret is a secret, and I'm the only one who knows it." He took up painting, becoming infamous for his portraits of clowns, including Pogo and a self-portrait as Patches the Clown and the Seven Dwarfs. These paintings became a source of morbid fascination and were sold to collectors, further cementing his place in the dark annals of popular culture. He continued to manipulate from behind bars, giving interviews in which he maintained his innocence or spun his bizarre tales of alternate personalities. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final words were a defiant and profane sneer at the world. "Kiss my ass." The legacy of John Wayne Gacy is profound. He shattered the archetype of the trusted neighbor and the friendly community man. His case revealed how monstrous evil could wear a mask of utter normalcy, operating in plain sight for years. The image of the smiling clown became irrevocably tainted, a symbol of hidden malevolence. His crimes led to changes in police procedures and a greater awareness of the patterns of serial murder. More than anything, the house on Summerdale Avenue and its ghastly crawl space became a permanent fixture in America's collective nightmare. A chilling reminder that you can never truly know what lies buried just beneath the surface. The story of John Wayne Gacy is a terrifying study in deception. He built a fortress of respectability around a dungeon of horror. So, what do you think? Was Gacy's public persona as Pogo the Clown just a mask, or was it a genuine part of a fractured personality? And why do you think a man so desperate for public approval would engage in acts that would ultimately destroy it? Share your thoughts and theories with us in the comments. For more in-depth criminal analysis like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Your support gives us the strength to shed light on these dark stories.